36-year-old Karen Gregory had always been a free spirit. From the time she was born in upstate New York back in 1948, Karen would become known among her family and friends as a person who challenged the conventional way of doing things. By the time Karen was enrolled in her local parochial high school, she was making her 3 younger siblings double over with laughter with inspired imitations of the elderly nuns who ruled their classrooms with iron fists. When it came time to go to college, Karen convinced her parents to let her leave their small hometown and go to a college in Rochester, a city in western New York. And when it came time to graduate from that college, an especially proud moment for Karen's very elderly grandmother, Karen made a point of ignoring the school's strict dress code. Instead of wearing stockings and heels under her gown when she received her degree in art education, Karen clomped across the stage wearing massive hiking boots. When her grandmother in the crowd noticed them, she let out a gasp that was so loud that for a moment, the entire ceremony came to a halt. And after college, Karen leaned hard into the hippie movement of the 1960s. After Karen left home for good, her parents were horrified to pick up the newspaper one day and find a picture of their daughter's familiar smiling face peering out at them from the middle of a group of Vietnam War protesters. And even after the 1960s gave way to the less radical 1970s, Karen's choice of marriage and careers were no less shocking to her very conservative parents. When Karen got married in 1971, at the age of 23, she skipped the traditional Catholic wedding service, opting instead for a small ceremony that was not attended by any of her family members, and then she settled down in Fitzwilliam, a tiny and isolated town in New Hampshire. There, Karen found a job teaching art to elementary school children, and she also got another job helping to care for the mentally ill. When she was home with her husband, Karen would tend to the couple's sprawling garden and make their vegetarian meals completely from scratch. But if Karen's style of marriage and careers were not exactly in line with what her parents had hoped for, her divorce a few years later was even more of a shock. Karen's family believed her marriage was solid. But according to Karen, she and her husband just kind of drifted apart and now just wanted to be friends. Then, after the divorce was finalized, Karen did not change her last name back to her maiden name, which was Marshall. Instead, she announced that she was formally changing her last name to her mother's maiden name, Gregory. And then, when love knocked again at Karen's door after her divorce, this time Karen just avoided marriage and moved in with her new boyfriend, who was a potter, someone who makes pottery. And before long, Karen had also learned the craft of throwing clay on the potter's wheel while living in a big and drafty house and adopting a collection of stray cats. And through each of Karen's rebellions, her 2 younger brothers and her younger sister were always there to support her. They loved their sister. She was the family trailblazer. Her independence and sense of humor and ability to tell wonderful stories had made all of their own passages to adulthood that much easier. Even Karen's mother, Sophia, who had fought so hard with Karen over some of her daughter's life choices, found herself reaching out to Karen when Sophia's own marriage to Karen's father ended in divorce. But it wasn't until January of 1983 that Karen, without any prompting at all from her family, suddenly decided to make her most radical lifestyle change yet. After spending her whole life, 35 years, in the cold northeast of the United States, living in the center of tightly knit towns and communities where like-minded people shared everything from tomato seeds to granola recipes, Karen made a complete about-face. She was simply done with the cold, with the garden, with the cats, and with the potter boyfriend. And so just when winter was hitting its stride in New Hampshire in January of 1983, Karen packed up her Volkswagen and headed south to Florida to start a brand new life. She had decided to join her sister, Kim, who was married and working as a nurse in Pinellas County, a peninsula of land that hangs like a fishhook off the central west coast of Florida. While Kim and her husband had made their home in the northern tip of the peninsula, Karen drove right down to the bottom of the fishhook. And within a few months, Karen was living in an apartment she shared with a roommate in the historic Florida beach town of Paso Grill. Picking up a waitressing job in nearby St. Petersburg, Karen luxuriated in the winter heat of her new home and spent hours of her spare time biking along the beautiful white sand Florida beaches. Pinellas County was bigger, sunnier, and in places far more developed and paved over than anywhere else Karen had ever lived. But it didn't take long for her to make plenty of new friends, to cut her hair, and to dress in more stylish local attire. Karen's olive skin quickly picked up a deep tan that set off her dark brown hair and arresting blue eyes. Already fit and strong, the walking and biking added even more tone to her slender 5'5" frame. And Karen soon became an expert at turning away the unwanted attention of patrons at The Garden, the popular restaurant bar in St. Petersburg where she worked. But in March, 3 months after Karen arrived in Paso Grill, Karen met the man who would become the love of her life. The administrator of a counseling program for Vietnam veterans, David Mackey, was strikingly handsome and well-educated, and in a state where so many residents were transplants like Karen, David was a native Floridian and longtime resident of the nearby town of Gulfport, located just 9 miles to the northeast of Paso Grill. And this time, it was Karen who was the one asking for a first date, not her would-be suitor, David. In 1984, interracial relationships were just not as common and socially acceptable as they are today. It was just a different time. And Karen was Caucasian and David was African American. Additionally, David was 7 years younger than Karen. He was 29. But neither of those facts made the slightest difference to Karen, or, as it would turn out, to David. And before long, David and Karen were a certified couple. And together they went sailing, they went to movies, and to concerts that featured the popular Jamaican-style reggae music they both loved. In March of 1984, so 1 year after Karen and David had met, David threw a surprise party for Karen on her 36th birthday. And it was clear to all of the partygoers that these two were deeply in love and practically living together in David's house in Gulfport. After that, things in Karen's life moved quickly. In May of that same year, just 2 months after Karen's surprise birthday party, Karen landed a good job as a graphic artist with a St. Petersburg company called Datacom that produced technical drawings and illustrations. And around that same time, she and David decided to make their relationship more formal. Instead of just meeting up every night to spend time together, the couple decided Karen would move out of her apartment in Paso Grill and live full-time with David in his modest but very comfortable home in Gulfport. Although Karen was excited about this upcoming move, David's quiet neighborhood, a few blocks away from the water, would be a big change from the beachfront charm and laid-back vibes of Paso Grill. David's 3-bedroom house, with its glassed-in front porch, sat right on a corner lot. There was a big oak tree that sat on one side of the property that shaded half of the single-story white home, leaving the other half of the building to bake in the sun. Although the couple who lived across the street from David were young and lived in Gulfport year-round, many of David and Karen's other neighbors were older, and some were retirees who only lived in Florida during the winter months. And while David had always felt welcome in Gulfport, he and Karen could both sense that as an interracial couple, they drew the occasional disapproving look or stare. But overall, one look around the neighborhood was enough to tell anyone passing through its tree-lined streets that what residents here really seemed to value the most was their sense of safety and tranquility. Because peppered throughout her new community, Karen had seen the same sign posted in conspicuous places on many lawns. In big letters, the signs read, "Warning, this is a Citizens Crime Watch area." And even if all those warnings seemed a little alarmist, given how sleepy the neighborhood was, Karen was okay with it. To her, Pinellas County was this huge metropolis compared to where she had moved from, Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire, and so she was naturally a little more paranoid about her safety. To celebrate all the good fortune in Karen's life, Karen and her sister Kim arranged a family day at the beach. And so on May 19th, Karen and David spent the day with Kim and her husband and their daughter. It was a perfect spring day in central Florida, the hot air cooled by a breeze off the ocean, and a few clouds offered intervals of shade from the bright sun. And the adults had plenty to talk about, especially Karen and Kim. Karen was nearly fully moved in to David's house, she was happy about her new job, and she and Kim were both excited at the prospect of their mother, Sophia, potentially moving out to Florida as well. On the following Monday, Karen said that David was leaving for a work conference in Rhode Island that would last most of the week. After living with a roommate in Paso Grill or staying over at David's house, Karen was a bit out of practice when it came to spending nights alone. But in spite of being a little nervous at the prospect of doing just that, Karen told Kim that she'd use the time to finish moving and unpacking. And on the upcoming Tuesday night, May 23rd, Karen said she had made plans to have dinner with her good girlfriend, Naverne Covington. Not only would that dinner be a chance for the friends to spend a fun evening together, but also Naverne would be leaving the next day to attend a wedding, and Karen needed instructions on feeding Naverne's cat and watering Naverne's plants while she was away. And by the time Tuesday night did roll around, Karen was glad for the dinner date she had made with Naverne. After switching out of her work clothes into a sleeveless white t-shirt and baggy green shorts and tennis shoes, Karen headed to Paso Grill to make a few trips from her apartment to David's house with the last of her belongings. And at about 7:30 p.m., with the final box of her plants safely stowed in the back of her Volkswagen, she decided to go straight from Paso Grill to Naverne's house in Gulfport. A few hours later, as Karen left Naverne's house not long after midnight, Karen smiled. The evening could not have gone any better, and after all the changes of the last several weeks, dinner with her close friend was exactly what Karen had needed. The two women had laughed and talked over their glasses of white wine and plates of vegetable stew that had filled Naverne's cozy kitchen with the smell of herbs and garlic. And when the two friends said goodnight, Karen had surprised Naverne by pausing at the door and giving Naverne a quick, tight hug. Even though Naverne laughed and told Karen, "I'm only going to be gone for a couple of days," Karen had suddenly wanted Naverne to know that Karen would miss her. Walking to her car and sliding into the driver's seat, Karen smiled again. She would now head back to the little house she shared with David, and she'd bring in her last few boxes of plants, and when David called the next day to check in, Karen wouldn't even tell him about how much progress she'd made unpacking and blending their furnishings and belongings together. Instead, she wanted him to be surprised when he returned from his trip. A few minutes later, Karen pulled her little car into the driveway of 27th Avenue South and Upton Street. After parking her car next to David's car, he had left it behind for this business trip, Karen opened her door and climbed outside. After collecting her last few boxes of things from the trunk, Karen headed inside and locked the door behind her. Even though it was well past midnight, Karen wasn't quite ready to go straight to bed. She had been having trouble sleeping the last few nights, and so she decided she would just sit down and relax for a little while. Less than 1 hour later, a blood-curdling scream ripped through David and Karen's quiet neighborhood. Hearing it, several of Karen and David's neighbors sat bolt upright in their beds, wondering what was going on. One woman told herself that it must have been a cat or some other animal. Another woman remembered thinking that whoever had screamed had really strong lungs. And another woman pulled her husband back inside when he stepped out onto their front step to investigate. 1.5 days later, a woman named Amy Bressler was standing at her living room window talking to someone on the phone and looking out at David Mackey's house. At one point, she told the caller, "Yes, I can see Karen's car in the driveway." A minute later, Amy put the phone receiver down on the table, left her house, and walked across the road to knock on the side door of David's house. When she didn't get an answer, she walked around to the front door. There too, Amy's knock also went unanswered. But not before Amy noticed that some of the window panes in the front porch door had been broken. Walking again back toward the back of the house, Amy noticed curtains moving in one of the bedroom windows. When she stopped to look more closely, she saw that the reason they were moving is because the window was wide open. Amy reached through the open window and pushed the curtains aside and looked into David's house. A minute later, crying hysterically, Amy had stumbled back inside of her own house. Reaching for the phone she had left on the table, she could picture David Mackey at the other end of the line, stuck at his work conference in Rhode Island and frantic with worry after all his calls to Karen during the last 30 hours had gone unanswered. But before David could even ask his neighbor if Karen was okay, all Amy could manage to tell him in a voice choked with tears was, "David, it's something horrible. I need to get the police." A few minutes later, at 8:39 a.m., 22-year-old Gulfport police officer Cheryl Falkenstein was climbing through that open bedroom window on the side of David's single-story house. Even if she had been on the police force for 5 years instead of just 5 months, the young officer would not have been prepared for what she saw in the hallway just beyond the bedroom. When Amy's 911 call had come into the station a few minutes earlier, the dispatcher had told Officer Falkenstein and emergency medical personnel that they were responding to a report of a non-responsive person. But in fact, it was instantly clear to Officer Falkenstein that this person was not just non-responsive, they were dead. It was also instantly clear that the deceased, Karen Gregory, had been the victim of a gruesome and violent attack. And not only that, but from the small lake of dried blood that surrounded Karen's half-naked body, the stiffness of her limbs, and the smell of decomposition, she had obviously been lying undiscovered in this hallway for some time, first injured, and then, when no help came, dead. Within minutes of Officer Falkenstein reporting the murder, yellow crime scene tape surrounded David's corner property, and the quiet neighborhood of Gulfport was crowded with law enforcement and medical personnel. The last time the tiny Gulfport Police Department had processed a major murder scene had been 23 years earlier. And so the Pinellas County medical examiner, who was among the first to arrive on the scene, immediately told local police that she was going to ask the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to help out with the investigation, because it was already clear from the doctor's preliminary examination of Karen's body that this could shape up to be a very difficult case. Dr. Joan Wood did not need to do a complete autopsy to see that Karen had been dead long enough for rigor mortis to set in and for the blood on her body and throughout the small house to dry. This also meant that any physical evidence left on or inside of Karen's body would likely have degraded during the time that Karen had gone undiscovered. So, even though police could clearly see bloody handprints on Karen's body and on the bedroom windowsill, those prints might or might not prove useful as evidence. Compared to the large staff from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Gulfport only had 3 detectives, and all of them had arrived at the crime scene shortly after the 911 call to dispatch. By then, the first patrol officers on site had already begun to interview Karen and David's neighbors, contact Karen's family, and contact Karen's boyfriend, David, who was already arranging air travel to get from his conference in Rhode Island back to Florida. Reached by phone in Rhode Island, David told police that he had spent most of the day on Wednesday, May 23rd, the day after Karen's dinner with Naverne, reaching out to Karen's friends, family, and employers, as well as local hospitals and police departments to try to figure out where Karen was and why she wasn't answering his calls. But it was only when he finally called his neighbor, Amy, who lived up the street from David, and asked her to please go check his house to see if Karen was okay, that David got his answer. Meanwhile, it hadn't taken local police long to realize that at least a dozen of David's neighbors had heard what police now assumed was Karen's scream for help at about 1:15 a.m. in the early morning hours of May 23rd. Even though they described this scream as being short, high-pitched, and agonizing, and so distressing that several neighbors had trouble falling back to sleep after hearing it, no one in the Crime Watch neighborhood of Gulfport had bothered to pick up their phones and call the police. By late afternoon on May 24th, more than 30 hours after that scream, Gulfport investigators had already reached several conclusions about the murder of Karen Gregory. Given the report of a scream at 1:15 a.m. on May 23rd, police assumed the time of death was also during the early morning hours of May 23rd. Since there was no sign of forced entry and items of any obvious value were still inside the house, this did not look like a crime that started as a break-in or robbery. What was clear was that even though Karen must have willingly opened the door to her attacker, she had later used every ounce of her strength to try to fight off that attacker. Because from one end of the house to the other, Karen had left a trail of blood, from stains on the unmade bed in the bedroom, where Karen's faded green shorts and tennis shoes lay scattered on the floor, to the blood spatter along the walls of the hallway and living room, right up to the smeared and stained bedroom windowsill and curtains that marked where the killer had exited the house after the attack. And Karen's willingness to fight back and cry out for help could have saved her life if anyone who heard her had called the police. Because at some point in the struggle, it looked to investigators like Karen had almost escaped from her attacker. After finding more blood and strands of Karen's hair on the glass inside the front porch, investigators theorized that at one point Karen had made it through the inner front porch all the way to that porch door where the screen was covered by angled slats of glass rather than solid wood. And it was probably there, as Karen had reached that outer door and opened it up, that she had let out that terrible scream. However, seconds later, her attacker had reached her again and yanked her back inside of the house, knocking most likely Karen's head against the door slats, causing them to shatter and leave glass fragments outside on the front walkway. And then shortly after Karen was pulled back inside of the house, the killer finished her off. Police also assumed that Karen's attacker had forced her to wear the black lace lingerie that was pulled on over her white t-shirt and was now bunched up at Karen's waist. Aside from the brutality of the murder, two things about the crime scene stood out to detectives as potentially important pieces of physical evidence. Since there was no blood on Karen's bare feet, that meant that the bare footprints left in the blood-soaked carpet and the smudge of a heel print left on the bathroom tile just off the hallway where Karen was found must have both been left by her killer. And as the crime scene techs would later confirm, the handprints on Karen's naked thigh and lower back were positioned in such a way that they could not have been made by Karen. So, like the footprints, the handprints also had to belong to Karen's attacker. Investigators got their first break in the case when one of the Gulfport officers doing door-to-door interviews realized that the neighbor who lived across the street from David's house was another public safety officer, St. Petersburg firefighter George Lewis. Although George was at work when Karen's body was discovered that morning, when contacted by phone, George immediately reported to the Gulfport police station and wrote out a 2-page statement. That statement contained all the information he could recall, at least right then, from the morning of and the days before Karen's murder. It turned out that George, in addition to being a firefighter, was also the unofficial head of the neighborhood crime watch. And he was also the only person in the neighborhood who had actually kind of reacted to the sound of that scream. To George, who had been inside of his garage working on his motorcycle with the radio turned on, the scream had actually sounded faint. And when he stepped outside and did not hear or see anything suspicious, he had assumed all was well before going back inside of his house and reassuring his girlfriend, who had also heard the scream, that everything seemed okay. At that point, the couple had just gone to bed, and then for the next day and a half, like everyone else in the neighborhood, they had just gone about their daily lives as normal. George had known David and Karen by sight, but he had not met Karen and he had not seen her at any point on the day before she was killed. Even though George was not able to shed any light on circumstances surrounding the actual murder, the 22-year-old firefighter was able to give police some solid leads on possible suspects. One was a man who mowed the grass at David's house on Tuesday morning, the last day Karen was alive. The second tip helped explain a note that police had found shortly after discovering Karen's body that had been left under the windshield wiper of David's car. Whoever had left the note had signed it Peter. At about 7 p.m. on May 23rd, the evening after the murder, George had seen a man drive up to David's house in a van, get out of the van, and walk up the front sidewalk to David's house where he knocked on the front porch door. When no one answered, the man went back to his van and a moment later emerged with a note that he left on David's car before driving away. By late that evening, hours after George had given his written statement to police, local investigators were close to crossing the man who had mowed David's lawn off of the suspect list. In addition to providing police with his fingerprints and a DNA sample, the man could also confirm that he had a solid alibi for the night of Karen's murder. The same would be true when police had a chance to finally interview David Mackey, who reported to the police station as soon as he arrived back in Gulfport late on the day that Karen's body was discovered. David had been in Rhode Island since Monday, and other members of the conference were able to confirm that he had not left the conference for any significant stretch of time. But it was the third possible suspect, the mystery man named Peter, who had left that note on David's car, who the police really wanted to speak to. So, when an officer inside of David's house answered a call from a man looking for Karen, who identified himself as Peter Cumble, the officer grabbed his notebook to take down all of the details. Yes, Peter said, he was a friend of Karen and David's. He had stopped by to see them on May 23rd to give Karen a cassette tape of music, as well as to confirm a dinner date the three of them had planned for later in the week. And yes, when he'd walked to the front door, he had noticed broken glass right outside on the sidewalk. But before detectives could even make plans to interview Peter showed up at the county morgue with Karen's friend and former roommate to make a formal identification of Karen's body. Afterward, Detective Larry Tosi invited Peter to the police station to question him about his movements at the time of Karen's murder and about his visit to Karen and David's house on May 24th. And even after Peter again told police that he really had only stopped by to drop off a cassette tape of music for Karen and to confirm dinner plans with the couple, Peter quickly went from possible suspect to prime suspect. First, there was the note that Peter, the host of a local radio program, had left on David's car. It was the last phrase of the note that raised the hairs on the back of the investigators' necks. "Hello," the note read. "Stopped by about 7:15 or so, but I saw no signs of life." In addition, during Peter's interview, Detective Tosi had noticed a scratch on Peter's hand. And while Peter insisted he'd gotten the scratch while playing with his dog, the investigator had to wonder if maybe Peter had gotten that scratch while struggling with Karen. And even though Peter's roommate said that as far as he knew, Peter had been at their apartment on the night and early morning that Karen was murdered, investigators thought Peter's alibi might be flimsy, especially when David and Karen's former roommate told police that they thought Peter had actually been romantically interested in Karen. If Peter had been jealous or obsessed with Karen, that might be a motive for murder. In addition to Peter Cumble, police had plenty of other leads to follow too. A man Karen had met when she was a waitress in St. Petersburg, who had repeatedly and unsuccessfully asked her to go out on dates, and a coworker from Datacom who had also shown Karen a lot of unwanted attention and whose name was written on the bottom of a piece of blood-stained paper that David had found inside of his house after Karen's murder. By June 1st, when Detective Tosi, the most experienced of the three Gulfport detectives, left Florida for a month-long family vacation, he fully expected that by the time he got back, the Karen Gregory murder case would be solved. But the 13-year veteran of the Gulfport Police Department was wrong. When Detective Tosi had returned at the beginning of July from 4 relaxing weeks in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, not only did the case file look disorganized, but all those promising first leads were starting to look like dead ends. But even after Sergeant Tosi had been assigned to replace the junior detective who had handled the case while Detective Tosi was on vacation, investigators still faced one disappointment after another. The man who had mowed David and Karen's lawn, along with the man who had hounded Karen for dates at work, both passed lie detector tests, and the DNA samples they had given police did not match any prints that crime scene techs had found at David's house. Peter Cumble, the man who had left that note on David's car the evening after her murder, had now hired a lawyer. But, like the other initial suspects in the case, Peter's fingerprints and DNA did not match any of the evidence taken from the crime scene. And the quality and handling of all that physical evidence had also turned out to be a huge problem for local investigators. As far as Detective Tosi was concerned, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement could have and should have done a better job securing and processing the crime scene. The state crime techs told local law enforcement that the bloody finger and handprints on Karen's body were too old and degraded by the time Karen's body was discovered for the techs to match the prints they had collected against the prints of any possible suspects. The state crime unit said the same was true of the partial footprint they had found on the tile floor of the bathroom that opened out onto the hallway where Karen's body was found. And there had been no going back for a second look at any of that physical evidence. On the same day that Karen's body was discovered and the Florida Department of Law Enforcement processed the scene, when the state crime techs left, they allowed 2 of Karen and David's friends to completely clean and scrub and vacuum the house. The friends didn't want David to see any sign of the obvious horror that had surrounded Karen in her final minutes of life, but that decision by the state crime unit had also meant that within hours of the assault, all physical evidence of the crime had been literally wiped away. Meanwhile, the autopsy report from the county medical examiner was also disappointing. A closer examination of Karen's body had revealed a wound that had not been immediately visible under all the blood that had covered Karen's face and torso. And the examination had also revealed the presence of semen inside of Karen's body, which confirmed that Karen had likely been sexually assaulted before her murder. But by the time Karen's body had been found, the semen was too old and degraded to provide a useful DNA match to DNA samples collected from potential suspects. By late fall and early winter of 1984, 7 months after Karen's murder, Detective Tosi felt like he was grabbing at straws. He'd asked the Florida Crime Unit to take another look at all the fingerprints and that footprint. He'd asked for a psychological workup of the possible murderer, and he'd also followed up on reports of a possible prowler in Gulfport, someone who was peering into windows and watching residents go about their nighttime rituals. He had also circled back to David Mackey, who was repeatedly asking police about what progress they'd made on the case, as a prime suspect. Even though it appeared that David was in Rhode Island at the time of the murder, the investigator had not been able to rule out the possibility that David had made an overnight airplane trip back to Florida to murder Karen and then returned to Rhode Island by the next morning. But, like the detective's other prime suspects, David 100% passed a lie detector test, and by Thanksgiving of 1984, the detective felt like once again he was back to square one. And even if he had a viable suspect, Detective Tosi had no physical evidence that he could use to link that person to the scene of the crime. It wasn't until Christmas of 1984 that police received the tip that would help them uncover the identity of Karen's murderer. At a farewell party for Gulfport's departing town manager, a casual conversation between an off-duty police officer and one of the city's bus drivers resulted in a complete rethinking of the murder investigation. What Detective Tosi discovered when he followed up on the story told by the bus driver, who lived 3 blocks away from Karen and David's house in Gulfport, would send shockwaves throughout Pinellas County and then all of Florida. Based on the follow-up investigation into that new information, here is a reconstruction of what law enforcement officials believe happened to Karen Gregory in the early morning hours of May 23, 1984. It was sometime after midnight when Karen gave her friend Navern a big hug and thanked her for the dinner and conversation. And it was not long after that Karen pulled her little Volkswagen car into her driveway, and then after getting her last few boxes of things from her trunk, she headed inside, locked the door, and sat down to relax. But just a few minutes later, she heard a knock on the front door. Given she was alone, and it was the middle of the night, Karen was likely startled and maybe even a little scared by the sound. But she still stood up and made her way over to the door. When she got there, she called out to see who was knocking. When she heard the person reply, Karen was instantly put at ease, and she unlocked and opened the door. As the door in front of him opened, Karen's killer felt a rush of excitement. For a while now, he had been watching Karen from a distance, and up close, looking at her now, Karen was even better looking than the killer had realized, with that dark brown hair and those eyes that were almost electric blue in her tanned face. The killer's first wife had hated his habit of staring at women, sizing them up as sexual partners. But tonight, the killer wasn't there just to look. He was there to actually have sex with Karen. Except when the killer had just casually stepped through Karen's open front doorway into her house before she had even invited him inside, Karen did not look remotely interested in him. And when the killer reached out and touched Karen, she had practically slapped him, pushing him away from her. And right then, something in this man snapped. It was the same feeling the killer had had when he'd wrapped his hands around his first wife's neck and squeezed her throat and told her to shut up and stop nagging him. Only that time, he'd stopped himself. This time, he wouldn't. The killer pulled out a knife and showed Karen, and then quickly began shoving and dragging her down the hallway toward her bedroom. Once inside, the killer ripped off Karen's shorts and underwear and then made her put on that black lingerie that he had found in one of her drawers, and then the killer flung himself on Karen and began to rape her. As he did, he began pressing the knife into Karen's chest, just below her collarbone, and when it finally broke the skin, Karen struck him to get him to stop. But instead of her blow causing the killer to stop, it enraged him, and he began stabbing Karen repeatedly around her neck. But just as he started to do this, Karen somehow managed to break free and make a run for the front door. and she had almost escaped. She'd gotten through the front door all the way to the front porch door with the slats of glass panes over the screen. It was then that Karen screamed that terrible, piercing scream before the killer had caught up to her, grabbed her, and pulled her back into the house, smashing her head into the glass panes, causing them to shatter out onto the walkway. It had taken all of the killer's strength to pull Karen back inside of the living room and then back down the hallway toward the bedroom. And even then, Karen somehow broke free a second time and lunged for the bathroom. The killer had had to step onto these slippery bathroom tiles to pull Karen out into the hallway again before wrestling her to the floor. And that was where he finished his attack, beating and stabbing Karen until she was finally and completely still, lying on her side in the carpeted hallway. The medical examiner would later make a list of Karen's wounds. One of her hands was cut and scratched, one of her fingers broken, her face, head, and upper body covered with so much blood from 13 separate stab wounds to either side of her neck that it was impossible to see the slash the killer had also made straight across her throat. Finally, the killer stood up, his chest heaving and his bare feet pressing into the blood-soaked carpet. And as he looked around the dim, blood-spattered hallway, the killer suddenly seemed to realize what he had done. Just a few minutes earlier, he'd seen Karen from his garage, watched her unpack the boxes from the back of her car, and suddenly he'd thought of the perfect excuse to get into the house with her. A moment later, he'd been at her door, knocking, calling out his name so she wouldn't be scared, letting her know that he just wanted to make sure everything was fine because he'd noticed that she'd come home late. And as a firefighter and the unofficial head of the neighborhood crime watch, George Lewis, the guy who lived just across the street from her and David, was just checking to make sure Karen was okay. Standing in the hallway now, George wasn't even sure how long he'd been inside of David Mackey's house. But George did know that he had to get out before anyone came, and before Glenda, his soon-to-be wife and soon-to-be mother of his first child, began to wonder where he'd gone and why he wasn't still in the garage working on his motorcycle. A moment later, George was climbing out the window of David and Karen's bedroom, leaving bloody marks on the sill and the curtain. Then he was running barefoot back to his house across the street, past the Crime Watch sign he'd posted so prominently on his property, and around to the back of the garage where he would wash Karen's blood off under the outside faucet. From there, George would walk into the kitchen and tell Glenda not to worry, that the scream she had just heard was nothing. He'd checked it out, there was no disturbance anywhere, they were safe. Later, after he had showered and was lying in bed with Glenda, George could not believe his luck. No one in the neighborhood had called to report Karen's scream, and Karen's body would go undiscovered for more than 30 hours. The medical examiner would later say that if someone had called the police after hearing the scream, there was a good chance that Karen could have survived her injuries. But by late summer, George's luck began to run out. Detective Tosi kept coming back to talk to George about the murder. The men were good friends, close enough that on December 15th, Larry Tosi would actually perform the wedding ceremony when George and his fiancée Glenda got married at the St. Petersburg fire station where George worked. And at first, the detective had come back to George in case the firefighter and leader of the neighborhood crime watch could remember anything new about the night that Karen was killed. After all, George had been the only neighbor who actually made any attempt to investigate the cause of that scream. And even when George began to slightly change his story, the detective just thought that George must be remembering additional details, not that George himself could be the murderer. It wasn't until that farewell party in December that Detective Tosi realized there was a fatal flaw in what George had been telling the police. During that party, the Gulfport bus driver, who lived a full 3 blocks away from David and Karen's house, told that off-duty police officer that even from that far distance, 3 blocks, she had heard Karen scream that night loud and clear. And if that was true, how was it possible that George, who lived literally right across the street from Karen and David, had only heard what he described as a, quote, faint scream? Even if George had had his radio on like he claimed, Karen's scream had to have been much louder than what George was reporting. And when Detective Tosi pressed George to explain this discrepancy, George's story started to unravel. And as he kept offering new versions of events for the night of Karen's murder, he also began to fail lie detector tests as well. In his original statement to police given on May 24, 1984, George had said he'd left his garage after hearing the scream, and after looking up and down his street, he'd seen nothing. In February of 1985, George told police that his earlier statement had actually been inaccurate. He said that after hearing the scream, he had looked across the street and seen a man standing on David and Karen's front lawn. And even from that far away from the other side of the road in the dark, George said he had been able to see every detail of what the man was wearing and what he looked like. When a police reconstruction of this scenario proved that it would have been impossible for George to see anyone that clearly from the door of his garage in the middle of the night, George just changed his story again, saying that, well, after he heard the scream, he had left his garage and walked closer to Karen and David's property, which is how he was able to see this mystery man on their property so clearly. And George said the reason he had not initially told police about this mystery man was because this man had threatened him that night, saying he would hurt him and his family if he ever reported seeing him. In George's final statement to police on March 15th, George told detectives that after this mystery man had made this threat, he had left Karen and David's property, at which point George, being curious, went inside of Karen and David's home, and at that point, he actually saw Karen dead on the floor. He told police he'd seen the slit across her throat, a detail that had not been publicly reported, and an injury that had been totally hidden by all the blood from Karen's other wounds. To police, the only way George would know that Karen had her throat slashed would be if he was the one slashing it. And even though the police had no actual proof that George had committed this murder, police suspicions deepened after they interviewed George's first wife. According to George's ex, during their year-long marriage, George had at times been violent and aggressive, like the time he had locked his hands around her throat and started to strangle her. She also described his habit of leering at women and looking constantly at pornography, as well as his overtly racist observations about African Americans. But it wasn't until Detective Tosi asked the FBI to run an analysis of the partial footprint left on the bathroom tile near Karen's body that police finally had the physical evidence they needed to link George to Karen's murder. Where the state crime lab had failed to come up with an image clear enough to match prints from potential suspects, the FBI had succeeded. And the bloody heel print on the bathroom floor, as well as the bare footprints left in the blood-soaked carpet, were an exact match to the footprint belonging to George Lewis, the man police now also suspected might be Gulfport's mystery prowler and peeping Tom. On March 15, 1985, Detective Tosi arrested George for the first-degree murder of Karen Gregory. After a lengthy trial and appeal, during which George testified on his own behalf that he had nothing to do with Karen's death, George was found guilty of both first-degree murder and sexual battery. And on June 2, 1989, 5 years after Karen Gregory's brutal rape and murder, 27-year-old George Lewis was sentenced to life in prison. 1 year later, in June of 1990, George's wife, Glenda, filed for divorce and sole custody of their 2 children. As for David Mackey, he moved out of the home he had shared with Karen and settled in Tampa, Florida, where he continued his career providing assistance and counseling services to veterans. George Lewis would die in prison in 2015. He was 52 years old. We'd like to give a special thanks to author and journalist Thomas French, whose series of newspaper articles and his book, Unanswered Cries, A True Story of Friends, Neighbors, and Murder in a Small Town, were our main sources in creating this episode. On Wednesday, April 26, 2006, a bright, beautiful, outgoing 18-year-old named Whitney Sarek began making her way across her campus towards her lecture hall where she had a class that morning. Whitney was a freshman at Taylor University, which is an evangelical Christian liberal arts college located in Upland, Indiana. Upland is a little town that sits about 2 miles east of Interstate 69 and is situated right between the two much larger cities of Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. As Whitney made her way along the pathway across campus and she passed by other throngs of students hustling to their own classes, she suddenly had a pang of anxiety as she realized the end of the school year was fast approaching. And while Whitney was definitely excited to head back home to rural Gaylord, Michigan, where she was from, to spend her summer vacation, she was also kind of bummed because she would have to say bye to all of her new friends in college that she wouldn't see again until after summer break in the fall when the next school year started. Whitney had made a ton of friends over the course of her freshman year, and by and large they were other freshmen like herself. But she did have a few friends that were upperclassmen, because early in Whitney's collegiate career, she had discovered that upperclassmen were just as friendly as freshmen, and they came with the bonus of lots of experience and expertise, and if you just asked them for guidance or advice, they'd be happy to give it to you. And so over the course of the school year, anytime Whitney had an opportunity to interact with or be around upperclassmen, she would take it, thinking, maybe I can learn something. And in fact, that morning, as Whitney was making her way across campus, she saw a sign that was asking for students to volunteer to the next day head out to this banquet hall to set up this big banquet for the school's new incoming president. And so when Whitney walked over to the table and asked the people what this was all about, she would learn that the majority of the people that had signed up to be volunteers so far were upperclassmen. And so as soon as she heard that, Whitney was quick to write her name down as well. The rest of the day would go completely as normal for Whitney. She would go to her classes, she would study, she would meet up with friends, and then eventually in the evening, she would make her way back to her dorm room where she would go to sleep. Little did she know, when she put her head down on the pillow that night, she was within 24 hours of her life changing in the most drastic way imaginable. The following morning, Whitney got up early, she took a shower, she brushed her teeth, and then she spent quite a while just staring at her wardrobe, debating which outfit she was going to wear, and then finally she chose the one she wanted and she got dressed. Whitney was not vain, but she knew the whole day would be spent around upperclassmen and university staff, and so she wanted to look her best. On her way towards her door to leave, Whitney would stop and look in her mirror one last time to make sure she looked okay, and in this fleeting moment, as she's looking herself up and down, she couldn't help but feel a justifiable sense of pride in this woman looking back at her. She had gotten into a great college, she had moved hundreds of miles from home and lived alone by herself for the first time, and her grades all year had been excellent. And so as Whitney's looking at herself, she thought to herself, you know what, I'm doing pretty good. Whitney's gaze would move from her reflection up to the clock on the wall, and she would see she was running late. And so she quickly grabbed her jacket, she threw it over her shoulder, and she went out the door. When Whitney arrived at the meeting spot in the parking lot nearby, she saw there was a group of what looked like students standing around a university van. And so Whitney walked up to them, and sure enough, this was the group of volunteers. It consisted of 7 other Taylor students, most of which were seniors, and 1 university staff member. And so Whitney didn't know any of them, and so she quickly introduced herself, everyone said hi, and then because Whitney was the last person they were waiting on, very quickly after she arrived, they were kind of ushered into the van, and then the van pulled out of the parking lot and began heading north towards Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne was where the banquet hall was. It was located about an hour north. At some point during this drive north, Whitney struck up a conversation with a 22-year-old senior named Laura Van Ryn, who was sitting right next to her. Whitney and Laura were total strangers, but they looked so similar physically. They were both tall, blonde, and very slim, that when they first got onto the van, one of the other volunteers actually asked them if they were related. But it wasn't just physical similarities that Laura and Whitney shared. Once they got to talking, Whitney would learn that Laura had also grown up in a small rural Michigan town. It was called Caledonia, and it was located only a couple of hours south of Gaylord, where Whitney had grown up. After the van finally arrived in Fort Wayne, the volunteers got out, they went inside of the banquet hall building, and for the next several hours, they set up tables and chairs, they put out silverware, they hung up decorations, and the whole time, Laura and Whitney just stayed close together, continuing their friendly banter. And then around 7 p.m., when the banquet hall was ready for the next day's ceremony, the volunteers decided their work was done, and so they left the banquet hall building, they piled back into the van, and began heading south back towards their campus. For the first few minutes of the ride, Laura and Whitney would just continue to chat with each other, but pretty quickly they, like the rest of the people in the volunteer group, just were tired from all the hard work of moving things around, and so they became quiet and began looking out the window, just kind of keeping to themselves. About 30 minutes later, when the van was within a couple of miles of their campus, Whitney would turn and look next to her at Laura just for a second, and right as she did, Laura would actually look up and look at Whitney. And so for a really quick second, they made eye contact, and so Whitney kind of awkwardly smiled at her. And as Laura was smiling back at Whitney, Whitney realized something very strange. There was this bright light on the side of Laura's face. And then seconds later, that bright light had grown, and the entire interior of the van was completely whited out. And then a second later, someone towards the front of the van yelled, "Oh my God, no!" And then the van went completely silent. Within minutes, dozens of 911 calls were coming in from motorists on I-69 saying that something terrible had happened. When first responders arrived on scene, they were braced for the worst, but even still, they were shocked at what they saw. Scattered all over the northbound and southbound lanes of I-69, not far from Taylor University, were all these huge chunks of jagged metal, there was glass everywhere, and there were bodies everywhere. That light that Whitney saw growing on Laura's face that suddenly filled the entirety of the van were the headlights of an 80,000-pound, fully loaded tractor-trailer truck driven by Robert Spencer. Robert was a truck driver, and he was traveling north on I-69 when he fell asleep at the wheel, at which point his truck veered off the road into the grassy median between the northbound side and the southbound side of I-69. His truck bounced up onto the southbound lane and crashed into Laura and Whitney's van, and when it did, the impact literally peeled off the side of their van and sent the van spinning. And so as the van is spinning, because of this huge opening in the side of it, the students inside were literally being violently thrown out of the van into traffic. When first responders finally actually began surveying the crash site, they would find Robert still in his truck, he was alive, but they would discover that of the 9 occupants inside of that van, 5 were deceased. A few hours later, in the early morning hours of April 27th, Whitney Sarik's family, back home in Gaylord, Michigan, woke up to the sound of a phone ringing. When one of Whitney's parents answered the phone, it was the Grant County coroner telling them their daughter had been in a terrible accident and she was deceased. At the same time, 3 hours south of Gaylord, Michigan, in Caledonia, Michigan, the Van Ryn family also was woken up in the middle of the night to a phone call, except the call they got was that their daughter Laura had been in that same crash, but she had survived, although she was in critical condition. In the days that followed, the Sarik family had Whitney's body transported to Gaylord, and then they began to plan for her funeral. A funeral that would have to be closed casket because of the extensive damage to Whitney's body. Meanwhile, Laura Van Ryn's family rushed to Parkview Hospital in Fort Wayne, and they would find their daughter bandaged head to toe with a neck brace on, laying in a hospital bed in a coma. Doctors would tell Laura's family that even though Laura was now stable, there was no way of knowing if she would ever come out of that coma. And even if she did, she had suffered a serious brain injury, which likely would impact her ability to function. And so knowing that at best this was going to be a very long road to recovery, Laura's family decided to move her from Fort Wayne back home to Michigan to a rehabilitation center in Grand Rapids that specialized in brain injury. And so while the Van Ryns were in the process of moving Laura back to Michigan, the Sariks were in the process of saying their final goodbyes to Whitney. On April 29th, so 3 days after the accident, the Sariks would hold a visitation in their hometown of Gaylord. A visitation is a time for friends and acquaintances to come together and pay respects and offer condolences to the people that the deceased have left behind. For Whitney's visitation, more than 1,400 people attended, which was nearly half of Gaylord's total population. The following day, on April 30th, Whitney was buried. At the same time, Laura's family, who had been taking turns keeping a 24-hour bedside vigil with Laura in the Grand Rapids facility, were given some incredible news. Based on brain scans, it looked very much like Laura would wake up from her coma, although there was no timeline. Over the next couple of weeks, Laura remained comatose, but her body would slowly begin to heal, and all signs seemed to be pointing towards her eventually making a recovery. And then on Tuesday, May 16th, so 20 days after the accident, Laura woke up from her coma. And amazingly, at first, it seemed like her brain was functioning the way it should be. The family could not believe their luck. This was a miracle. Over the next few days, Laura would slowly regain her strength to the point where she could move some limbs and she could sit up in her bed. And then as for her cognitive function, it seemed like she was making strides, but then she would do something that would make doctors and her family and everybody around her start to question if her brain really was okay. On Monday, May 22nd, so 1 week after Laura had woken up from her coma, she was sitting in her hospital bed with her physical therapist right next to her, and her family was in the room as well. And at some point, her physical therapist handed Laura a pencil, and then she put a pad of paper in front of her. And then the therapist told Laura to write a word down that was very specific. It was a word that Laura should know well, and a word that Laura should be able to spell. And so after Laura kind of gave a nod saying she understood the assignment, Laura took the pencil and very awkwardly and painstakingly wrote out a word. But when she was done and the therapist looked at what she had written, it was wrong. It didn't make any sense. And so she asked Laura to do it again. And so Laura, with even more determination, would try to write this word. And once again, she wrote the same word, the same incorrect word. And so it was at this point that the therapist and the onlooking family started to realize that, her injury to her brain might be more extensive than we thought. However, as everyone in that room would soon find out, that was not the case. There was something much, much bigger going on. Back on April 26th, just minutes after the car accident, first responders began moving about the crash site to figure out who was deceased and who was still alive. When they found Laura, she was barely clinging to life on the side of the road, and so they rushed over to her, they put her on a stretcher along with her purse, which contained her driver's license. They put that all together, they put her on an ambulance, and they sent her to the hospital. Once Laura arrived at the hospital, doctors would use her driver's license inside of her purse to identify her, and then they began wrapping her head to toe in bandages and casts. And when bandages began coming off over the following weeks, it was immediately obvious to everyone that this accident had significantly altered Laura's physical appearance, most notably her teeth. They almost looked like they had been shifted to one side in her mouth. However, to Laura's family, they didn't care how she looked. They only cared that she was still alive. But on Monday, May 22nd, when Laura was handed that piece of paper and a pencil, and she was told to write her name, she did not write Laura, Laura. She wrote Whitney, Whitney. It would turn out a colossal mistake was made, and nobody caught it until that moment. The woman sitting in the hospital bed with the pencil and paper was not 22-year-old Laura Van Ryn. The woman sitting in the hospital bed was 18-year-old Whitney Sarek. When Whitney was found on the side of the road clinging to life, the first responders thought the purse next to her was hers, and so they opened it up, they found a driver's license, they looked at it, and they looked at the victim on the ground, and they looked identical, and so they said, okay, this is Laura. And amazingly, Whitney's purse that contained her driver's license happened to land on the ground next to Laura's body. And so Laura was misidentified as Whitney Sarek. A week after Whitney had written her name down on that pad of paper, it was officially confirmed that this was a case of mistaken identity. And so once again, the Sarek family received a call in the middle of the night from the Grant County coroner. Except this time, they were telling them that your daughter did not die in that car accident. She's alive. She's in Grand Rapids waiting for you. And so the Sarek family, they were completely shocked. They wanted this to be true, but it just seemed too good to be true. They had had a funeral for Whitney. They had buried Whitney. Except, because it was closed casket, they never saw Whitney. And so the Sareks hopped on a plane, they flew to Grand Rapids, and they walked into that hospital room, and there on the hospital bed was their daughter Whitney with her arms outstretched, crying, calling for her parents. While this, of course, was a miracle for the Sareks, it was at the same time a complete nightmare for the Van Rins. They had had their suspicions that something was off about their daughter, most notably her teeth, because they just didn't look like their daughter's teeth. But they had been told by the doctors and by anybody who would talk to them that it was perfectly normal for people involved in these very significant accidents to look completely different or even act completely different. And so the Van Rins just kind of put their suspicions to the side and focused on looking after their child and helping her recover. A few days later, Laura Van Rin's body, which had been buried in Gaylord, Michigan under the tombstone that said Whitney Sarek, was exhumed and her body was flown to Caledonia, where the Van Rin family was able to give their daughter a proper funeral and burial. Even though Whitney and Laura had only known each other very briefly during that volunteer event in Fort Wayne, their families would forge a bond over this shared trauma. And in 2008, 2 years after the crash, the Sareks and the Van Rins would co-author a book about their experience in going through this horrible event from each of their perspectives. That book is called Mistaken Identity: Two Families, One Survivor, Unwavering Hope. Also that year, on April 26th, so the second anniversary of the accident, Taylor University would dedicate a prayer chapel to the 5 victims. Since the crash, Indiana has changed their state's protocols and procedures for identifying accident victims to ensure this type of mix-up can never happen again. As for Robert Spencer, the truck driver who caused the fatal accident, he would be sentenced to 4 years in prison. Our next story is called Random. In 2019, Meg Morer was a 21-year-old senior at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. She was studying ecology and evolutionary biology and planned to pursue a career in scientific illustration after graduation. This was a field that combined her skill as a scientist, her incredible artistic ability, and her general love of nature. But despite her intellectual brilliance, what Meg was actually known for was her very uplifting personality. When her mother was asked what her daughter was like, she said, "Well, it's like trying to describe what it's like to feel the warmth of the sun. There are not words to accurately describe what that feels like." And that was Meg. She was radiant, she was joyous, she was adventuresome, she was kind, she was really just a wonderful person to be around. In March of that year, just 2 months before their graduation, Meg and 2 of her close friends decided to go on a trip for spring break. This would be their last spring break as students, and they wanted to enjoy it. Because they were all in excellent physical condition, they decided they would spend the week hiking in Georgia. When Meg told her family about her big plans, they could tell she was extremely excited, and they just told her, be safe and we'll see you when you get back. On the morning of their departure, which was March 5th, Meg packed her suitcase into the trunk of her small green sedan, and then she drove over to her 2 friends' apartment building, and they came out and they put their suitcases into the car, and then once the car was all packed and all 3 of them were inside, they hit the road. The drive from Tulane University to this area in Georgia where they'd be hiking took about 8 hours if you didn't stop. But none of them were in a particularly big rush, and so they figured they would just stop along the way, and if they got to Georgia super late at night, so be it. After being on the road for 2 hours without stopping, they all needed to use the bathroom, and so Meg decided to pull over at the first rest stop she saw. And the first one she saw was in this residential town in Mississippi called Gaucher. So she pulls off the highway into this very nondescript rest stop, and all 3 of them get out. They go into the main building and they use the restroom. Meg was the first one to be done, so she came outside and she waited right near the bathroom door. And then her 2 friends, they finished up as well. They came out, and then the trio began walking back towards the parking lot where Meg's car was. At the same time, a man driving an 18-wheeler tractor-trailer truck was bombing down the highway right outside of this rest stop, and right before he was going to pass the area where this rest stop was, he heard something fall off the back of his truck. He instinctively checked both of his mirrors to see if maybe he could see what had fallen off, but he didn't see anything in the road, and so he just pulled over onto the shoulder and got out to see what was going on. When he walked towards the back of his truck, he expected to see, maybe one of the back doors had popped open or something like that. But even before he made it to the back of his truck and could even look at those back doors, he already knew what had fallen off the truck. 2 of his back tires were just gone. This truck had what's called dual rear wheels, which meant on the axle, there was not just one wheel on each side. Instead, there were 2 wheels on each side. So 4 wheels across one axle. And so each of these 2 wheels were bolted together and would turn at the same time and kind of functioned like one big fat tire. This gave the truck more stability and safety when it was towing. The driver, in a panic, looked back down the road in the direction he had just come, hoping to just see the tires somewhere, but they weren't anywhere to be found. And so, not really knowing what to do, he just instinctively called his boss and told him what was going on. And his boss just said, "Hold tight, I will send help out to you." And so this driver is left to just stand on the side of the road and wait for help to arrive. And so as he's doing that, he's just staring back down the road in the direction he had just come, as if these tires are just going to magically appear. And as he's looking in this direction, he starts to notice on the other side of the highway, there are police cars and ambulances streaming into a rest stop that he had just passed. And it was the rest stop where Meg and her 2 friends had been. It would turn out when these 2 tires became dislodged from this truck, they went careening across the highway to the other side, across oncoming traffic, all the way up into this rest stop, and they crashed directly into Meg right as she was climbing back into her car. These 2 tires combined weighed almost 1,000 pounds, and so the impact killed Meg. She was pronounced dead on the scene. After an investigation, it was not conclusively determined what actually caused these tires to fall off. The likely cause was they were missing a small part known as a locking washer that costs $3 and is very easy to acquire. But regardless, at this point, the incident is considered a freak accident. The next and final story of today's episode is called Goosebumps. In 2006, a 20-year-old woman named Sarah started having some very strange dreams about a woman named Aurora. She had a very striking face with sharp features and long black hair. Now, her dreams varied. Sometimes Sarah was in a crowd of people, or she was at her office, or she was just alone in a room. But in all of her dreams, Aurora would always show up. Either she would interact with Aurora and they would speak, but Sarah could never remember what they actually spoke about, or Aurora would just be in the crowd or in the background just watching Sarah. Now, she had these dreams enough that eventually Sarah began to think, I must know someone named Aurora. I must have come across this person, and now they're just kind of manifesting in my brain at night when I'm sleeping. And so she began going through her older posts on social media to look in pictures of her and of her friends to see if there was a woman with striking features and long black hair that was this Aurora person in her dream. But after looking through hundreds and hundreds of pictures, she couldn't find any indication that she had met this person, at least not according to her social media. And so Sarah began just going on Google and typing in, Aurora, long black hair, striking features. Has anybody dreamed about this? To see if there were people talking about having this type of dream on the internet. But she had no luck. Eventually, after about 3 or 4 months of having these strange dreams that Aurora was in, Aurora stopped showing up in Sarah's dreams. It was like it suddenly was all over. And so very quickly, Sarah just kind of forgot about it. A few years later, on Halloween night 2009, Sarah and a friend pulled off the highway into a gas station. They had been out with some friends celebrating Halloween, and now they were making their way back home. Sarah pulled into an empty spot right in front of the convenience store, and after they were parked, Sarah and her friend got out, they went inside, they got some snacks and drinks, and then they came back outside and climbed back into Sarah's car. A few moments later, Sarah had turned her car on, she had backed out, and she had driven past all of the gas station pumps, and she was making her way towards the single-lane strip of road that merged out onto the highway. It was how anybody who got into this gas station got back out onto the highway. And so as she's getting closer to the entrance of this short merge road, her phone suddenly rings. What happens next occurred over a span of just a few seconds, so it might seem like this is over several minutes, but this all happened pretty much simultaneously. So she's pulling up to the entrance of this merge road, her cell phone rings, and because there was no one behind her, it was not a busy night, Sarah decides to just stop her car, put it in park so she can safely take this phone call. And so she stops her car pretty much right in front of the entrance to this merge road, and she picks up her phone, she looks at the number, and she doesn't recognize it, but she picks it up anyways, and she says, "Hello." There was silence on her phone, and as Sarah is saying, "Hello, is anybody there?" another car from the gas station pulls up right behind Sarah's car, and they start honking their horn immediately. They're in a huge rush. And so Sarah, who's totally embarrassed that she's blocking traffic, she hangs up the phone, she puts it down, she puts her car back in drive, and she hits the gas. But this driver behind her is apparently in such a rush, they're so impatient, that they actually swerved around her, driving on the dirt off to the side of the road just to get around her, and then they sped off down the merge road back onto the highway. And literally, seconds later, another car that was already on the highway, a silver Honda Civic, lost control and smashed into this car that had just passed Sarah's car. So there's this huge car accident literally right in front of Sarah and her friend, who have now stopped the car. They're right at the end of the merge road looking at this horrible accident that they narrowly escaped. Sarah put her car back in park, she picked up her phone, and she called the police. When the police showed up a few moments later, they took down Sarah and her friend's version of events, and then a little while later, after the ambulances had left and after the two cars had been pulled off of the highway, one of the police officers pulled Sarah aside and told her that the driver of the Honda Civic and the driver of the car that had swerved around her had both been killed in the accident. Shocked, the only thing Sarah could think to do was to call back that number she didn't recognize that had effectively stopped her from getting onto the highway and maybe even stopped her from being hit by that Honda Civic. And so she wanted to talk to this person and thank them for saving her life. But when she called the number back, the person did not pick up. However, it went to her voicemail, and it said, "Hi, you've reached Aurora. Leave your name and number after the beep." Sarah could not believe it. She said she had never felt goosebumps like that in her entire life. The next day, Sarah tried calling the number again, and this time the woman, Aurora, answered the phone. The two got to talking, and Sarah explained her crazy dreams and now this crazy car crash thing and how it's all connected. And Aurora would tell Sarah, like, "That's amazing. This is a crazy story you're telling me, except I didn't call you last night. I have no idea how you got my phone number." And so at the end of this phone call, the two women really had not reached any sort of explanation for how this came to be, how they came to be talking. But they ultimately just said, "Okay, hey, thanks and best of luck to you," and then they hung up. After the call was over, Sarah found herself just kind of sitting there, not really sure how to react to what had just happened. It was such a totally bizarre thing that she had just been through over the past 24 hours, and then if you include the dream, this has been a multi-year-long thing. And so on a whim, Sarah just opens up her Facebook account and she plugs in Aurora's full name, because Aurora had given her her full name on this phone call they had just had. And when she looked at her phone, when the results came in, Sarah nearly fainted. Right at the top of the results page was this woman, Aurora's Facebook account, and her profile picture showed her face. And when Sarah looked at her face, it was the exact same face she had seen so many times in her dreams. It was the same Aurora with the striking features and long black hair. The woman in her dreams was the woman who called her and saved her life.